Well, the state of Victoria is about to be completely re-engineered. Not to fix the trains and not to save the hospitals and certainly not to deal with the crime crisis. If Jacinta Allen has her way, 7 million people will be impacted by the mystical claims of 65,000 Indigenous people. According to the government's treaty document released today, Victoria's 65,000 Aboriginals enjoy, and I quote, a sacred relationship with country. The preamble to the document says this relationship was, quote, born at the first sunrise and sustained for over 60,000 years. If your average farmer claimed a sacred relationship with his paddock stretching back to the first sunrise, he'd be laughed out of the planning office. But I digress. When you put the phrase sacred relationship with country in a government report, a cultural belief suddenly becomes the basis of legislation, and that's what happened today. Today, the Victoria Labor government introduced its statewide treaty bill. It creates a new Victorian Indigenous council to be called Gelangwal. Think Albanese's failed voice to Parliament if the voice had swallowed 3 protein shakes and a Red Bull. Its 33 representatives will be elected, but only Indigenous Victorians will be permitted to vote for them. And in the gerrymander to end all gerrymanders, the Indigenous body will have the power to decide who can and who cannot claim to be Indigenous and therefore vote for them. That's like letting Collingwood not only umpire their own matches, but decide who gets to play for the other side. It's not like non-Indigenous Victorians have been forgotten altogether, though. They'll get to fund this body to the tune of $70 million a year. It's a kind of compulsory diversity tax. So what will this high-priced, race-based bureaucracy do? Well, let's start with the kids, because let's be honest, it always starts with the kids. This body will develop a curriculum, teaching school children from prep to year 10 about the enduring harm of colonialism, dispossession and injustice. So forget reading, writing and arithmetic. The new curriculum is guilt, grievance and government-approved truth. Your kids might not graduate fluent in maths or in English, but they'll have certainly mastered perpetual resentment. And when those kids graduate to work in the public service, by the time most of our kids finish school, a public servant will be about the only job left, well, the Indigenous body will still govern their lives. You see, if the Victorian government get what they want, the newly created group will oversee the creation of training programs and workplace guidelines to ensure public sector employees are, and I quote, culturally capable. Your guess is as good as George Orwell's on what that means. But more ominously, the group will set key performance indicators to assess public sector executives on their cultural competency. If you thought KPIs were bad when they involved sales figures, just wait until your career hinges on whether or not you demonstrated enough cultural competency. Imagine losing your job because you didn't acknowledge country with enough emotion in your last quarterly report. And while the body won't have the authority to appoint people to government boards, amazingly, it'll be given the right to veto candidates who lack the appropriate cultural heritage experience. That's tribal gatekeeping. Little wonder First Peoples Assembly co-chair Nara Murray told journalists today, and I quote, "We stand at the beginning of a new era, the treaty era. We're at a turning point in this nation's history. Treaty offers us the chance to reshape the story of this country." Well, there's no doubt about that. And there's more. The new body will also be made the naming authority for geographical features in Victoria. So expect your GPS to start pronouncing place names like it's drunk. But if you think that's the last of it, you'd be wrong. The group will also be given the power to facilitate individual treaties between all the Victorian Indigenous groups and the state government. Now, this obviously paves the way for potentially dozens more individual treaties, which many believe will probably include reparations. And then there's this. They even get a dedicated named room within the Parliament of Victoria so they can host functions and have Indigenous representatives achieve unvetted access to the parliamentary building. A cool $37 million has been set aside to fit out that room, a kind of VIP room for one race only. Now, if that sounds suspiciously like a second parliament within the Victorian Parliament, I agree. It comes dangerously close to 7 million Victorians living under two parliaments, one accountable to you, the other accountable only to those who claim Indigenous descent. Premier Jacinta Allen has warned the opposition not to engage in, quote, deliberate misinformation, like those wicked souls who oppose the voice.
What I would hope as we take this incredibly important bill through the Victorian Parliament is that our political opponents, or indeed opponents to this bill, do not go down the path that we saw in 2023, a path of deliberate misinformation, at times just outright lies that were being peddled about what this actually was.
She's kidding, isn't she? I don't think opponents will resort to lying about the treaty. It'd be impossible to exaggerate just how shockingly racist and divisive Labor's proposal is.
This is a moment that the opposition have to grasp to drive better change for Aboriginal Victorians, because we all benefit as a society. And I still hold out a little bit of hope that they might find it in their hearts, but also importantly in their heads.
That they might find it in their heart. Translation, if you oppose me, it's because you're either cruel or stupid. That's typically the way Jacinta Allen operates. She learned it from Dan Andrews. You put forward the most ridiculous ideas and then you shame anyone who notices. Jacinta Allen said that the voice-like body would have input into every area of policy that affects Indigenous people.
But how it'll bring change is because it will be a requirement under law for governments, for agencies, for departments to not just listen, but actively consult and then be held to account.
So, unlike ordinary citizens who can be ignored, Galung Wall must be listened to and actively consulted. Imagine that. Ordinary taxpayers who fund the whole circus are usually rewarded with a form letter when they contact their local MP. But the Indigenous Assembly, they get a legal guarantee that they must be listened to and consulted. That's not representation, that's reverence. At the end of the day, the Victorian State Labor government is putting the interests of the 65,000 Victorians who claim Indigenous descent at the centre of the governance of a state of 7 million people because of their spiritual connection to the country. That's not democracy, that's theology. And Australians rejected the voice because they understood dividing citizens by ancestry, well, it's undemocratic. Jacinta Allen has decided those voters were wrong. So here we are, 7 million people governed not by reason, not by democracy, but by mysticism. It's not government, it's a new religion. And Victorian taxpayers are expected to tithe. By the way, some of you are no doubt wondering the name of this new Indigenous body, Galung Wall. What does that mean? Does it mean unity? Does it mean reconciliation? Does it mean healing? No, no, and no. The name literally means, according to a report in the Melbourne Age, tip of the spear. You can't accuse them of trying to hide their intent. And one last thing. A journalist tried to ask Jacinta Allen today why this was the first the public had heard from her on camera, given that in the past week Victoria's had 2 police officers shot, 2 young boys hacked to death with machetes, and a state generally falling apart. Well, here's the response.
Given that it has been a week of division and you've released several statements, is there a reason the public hasn't heard from you on camera for about a week, given the crisis that the state seems to be in? The public seems to keep wanting to see representation from you.
I'll answer that, but I just do want to make sure we close out any other questions on treaty.
What can you do but shake your head?